This is Jillian Loughran. Jillian is the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Center for Healing and Justice Through Sport. Say that 5 times fast. Um, or don't. No. Jillian is amazing. I've gotten the opportunity to get to know her over the past couple years and have listened to her speak numerous times. Every time I hear her speak, I get a nugget of information, something really interesting and fascinating that I am able to take with me. So, Jillian, thank you for being here. We are so excited to hear from you, and I will kick it over to you.
Thanks, Will. Hey, everybody. It's great to see some familiar faces. I've had the opportunity to hang out with the rowing community a few times, and it's always been wonderful. So big shoes to fill, y'all, just saying. I also have a colleague here. She's hiding without a background. Her name's Christine Bright, but she will answer way more detailed answers to questions probably than I can get to watching the chat. So if you wanted to pop something in there at all during the session, she's there for you. Oh, they changed the Zoom setup. 1 second, let me get myself set up. Here we go. There we go. Zoom changed it. Good to know. All right, so as Will said, I'm from the Center for Healing and Justice Through Sport. We believe that sport is a conduit of an essential tools, basically, that all young people need and deserve. We want coaches, mentors, any folks working with other humans to have a base understanding of what we mean when we say healing-centered sport and what they can do to be more intentional around that space. I'm really excited to be on the tail end of Tanita's chat because she hit on a bunch of things that we're going to dive into today. We believe at the center that you can't begin to create inclusive spaces until you examine your own implicit bias. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about how the brain works. We are a bunch of brain nerds over here at the center. And when you understand the brain, you will have a much greater insight into what behaviors are telling you. So we're going to start there. Then we're going to talk about where implicit bias lives in our brain. It is a neurobiological guarantee that all of us have implicit bias. It is not a bad thing. It is a survival thing. And so we're going to talk about what that means and how that shows up. We're also going to talk a little bit about how stress, adversity, and prior trauma impacts brain function, development and brain function, I should say. And the last piece of the work is how does sport uniquely help us do the things that help break down biases and heal? And so that's our journey today. Before I begin, we have a few ground rules that we always cover at the center. There is no forced fun here. So if anything we ask you to participate in is not your style, take it your way. Do it however feels good for you. We also know that your life doesn't stop because you're here. So please, anything that comes into your space that you need to handle, we will not be offended. And then lastly, please share with us. You all are the experts here. You know rowing better than I ever could pretend to. And so if there's anything that you think is important for the group to know, we want you to please add it. Christine, is there anything you would add before I dive in? Put her on the spot. All right, maybe not. All right, so we're going to start off with a little warm up. We're going to play a game of this or that. And the way that this is going to work is I'm going to give you two options and you get to answer either in the chat if that feels better for you, or you can do a movement. So for example, if I say, I love ice cream. If you want to say yes, you're just going to do some arm raises. And if you want to say no, you're just going to hit me with a neck roll. If you want to say yes in the chat, you're going to do a number 1. And if you want to say no in the chat, you will pop in a number 2. So again, the example, I'll give you a statement. I love ice cream. Yes is pumping. No is rolling. Yes is a 1. No is a 2. I see you, Amy. I love ice cream too. All right, so we're all warmed up. Here we go. They're going to get a little harder than that. Just a warning. I've always felt included in the rowing community. That's the first one. I've always felt included in the rowing community. Ooh, mixed bag, mixed bag. We're seeing a lot of 1s, a lot of 2s, kind of a combo. Awesome. I see some people doing the movements too. I see you. Awesome. Next one. I know of someone who dropped out because they didn't feel included in the space. And this can be rowing or any other space. Yeah, lots of ones. Thanks. And then the third one is, I believe rowing is accessible to all. Mixed bag, mixed bag. All right, this is the primed crowd to have this conversation then, because some of us feel like, yep, solid. Some of us feel like there's some work we need to do. And I think we can help each other get to a place of intentionality that'll work for the whole spectrum of kind of the folks and the feelings that are here. And so to begin, just want to talk about why bias for a second. Understanding bias is essential in unlocking inclusive strategies. We cannot be inclusive without being actively engaged in recognizing our biases, as I said. We all have biases. Neurologically, it is a guarantee in how we are developed. And sometimes they're benign and they don't harm anyone else. But other times, biases, especially when they're paired with social context that involves power, can be incredibly harmful to others. They can perpetuate harmful stereotypes, which can result in really negative and or violent treatment or exclusion of others, specifically certain groups, from opportunities. And so if we want to talk about being anti-racist, about being more inclusive to the gender gender non-conforming community, if we want to talk about physical ability and disability, we have to start here. Okay. To do that, we're going to start with the brain. We're going to do a basic overview of the brain, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how it functions. 3 big things to remember when we talk about the brain. It is plastic. It can always change. It's like teaching an old dog new tricks. You can do it. It just takes work. The second thing is it develops and functions from the bottom to the top. Everything about the brain, the way it was built, the way that information comes in and through it, bottom to the top. And what the last piece, and we're really going to hone in on this today, is that the parts of the brain that develop in our childhood show up in our life all the time. And they show up without us thinking about making them show up. They show up on their own. Okay. Let's start with the brainstem, because we're gonna go through this bottom to the top. So the brainstem is at the base of our brain. Any guesses? You can pop it in the chat. How old are we when the brainstem's developing? What do you think? 1. Love that. 0 to 3. Love it. Pros. We got some pros. In utero. Awesome. Yep. So the brainstem is developing all the way from in utero all the way up through early childhood. And we are really focused in that time of our lives on survival. And so the brainstem does all of the basic functions that we need to survive every day. Breathing, sweating, regulation of body temperature, all of that good stuff happens in the brainstem. Some people call it our reptilian brain because it reacts for us. Others call it our reflexive brain. There's a lot of different ways that people frame it, but the big thing to know is that it does it on its own. I'm not telling my body to swallow or digest or sweat. I wouldn't get anything done if I had to do that, right? So it's operating kind of independent of my thinking brain. As we move our way up the brain, we get to what we're going to call today, we're going to bucket a bunch of things together. There's many complicated parts. We're going to do 3 big buckets today. We're going to talk about the limbic system as our emotional center. It's the center that is reacting to the world around us and stimuli. I like to think of it as a periscope on a submarine, kind of looking around, deciding, is that a threat? Is this not a threat? Do I like it, etc. And one thing to note here is that this part of the brain is developing from early childhood through kind of your teenage years or your adolescence. The parts of the brain we use the most become the strongest. So remember when I said it's neuroplastic, it kind of operates like a muscle in that way. So the parts we use the most become the strongest. So it's not a surprise for those that work with youth and or adolescents, young adults, that they have really strong reactions, emotions, feelings, because they are trying to build that portion of their brain all the time. So they're kind of living in that section of the brain. And then as we move to the front of the brain up here, how old do you think we are when this guy's done developing up here, our prefrontal cortex? 25. Yep, that's good average. Mid-20s, sure. Yeah, never, Mark. I love that. Never, truly never. I agree with you, Mark. It's always plastic and it's always changing. But the scientific data tells us that mid-20s, ladies a little earlier than men. So we know that by kind of mid to late 20s, our brain is kind of fully cooked. This is the part of the brain that is responsible for all of the complex functions that we do day to day. So your ability to pay attention to this Zoom meeting is happening up in your prefrontal cortex. Your problem solving, your strategic planning, your reflection, all of that's happening in your prefrontal cortex. I'm sorry, Katie, that your brain broke this week. Hopefully I'll give you some stuff that makes it feel a little better as we go along. That was funny. One thing kind of to think about is that this is also the part of the brain that makes us uniquely human. Other species don't have the abilities that we do. Folks have heard me say this before, but if my dog peed on the carpet yesterday, he's not home thinking about how upset I am about him peeing on the carpet. He doesn't have that capability. Whereas if I peed on Will's carpet, I would be mortified, right? Yeah, totally. Thinking about how I'm going to make it up to Will and save face and be better next time, right? So that's the part of the brain that we need to be functioning at its peak at all times. And it would be great if our brain just could do what it was supposed to do and nothing got in the way of that. And I could access this prefrontal cortex all day, every day. But there's some stuff that gets in the way. And that stuff is stress, any form of stress, adversity, trauma, all forms of stress, because they live in a network of response connections that we call the stress response system. And they live right in between our brainstem and our limbic system. So the analogy I like to use is imagine your brain's an elevator. First floor is the brainstem. Second floor is the limbic system. Third floor is the prefrontal cortex or the frontal lobes. If we're stuck at the brainstem, we can't access all that good stuff in front of us. We can't access the prefrontal cortex, those complex functions. What we know is that that stress response system, it can either be formed through our developmental years, or a stressor can be particularly acute. But when we've experienced overwhelming stress and or trauma, that stress response can get really, really strong. So just like the other parts of the brain, the parts we use the most become the strongest. If we're frequently utilizing our stress response system, it can become what we term it as oversensitized. And so something little feels like something big because our stress response system is so conditioned to being in control. So it's like if I was going home to a bear every night and I had to think to myself, what am I going to do? Am I going to fight, flight, freeze, one of those every single night? Eventually, my stress response system just won't turn off. It'll just stay on to keep me safe. And that's another way to think about an oversensitized stress response. But it gets in the way of all of the functioning above it. So if we can't help folks get through that stress response, they're not going to be able to do all of the strategy that you're doing in practices. They're not going to be able to do all of the communication and conversation that Tanita was talking about being essential when we're doing this work. You can't access those parts of your brain until we become regulated. And so we look at it like two sides of a coin, dysregulation and regulation. Dysregulation is where you are not in control. Your stress response is taken over and your body is reacting. Your brain and body is reacting. Regulation just means that you have control of your systems. So ideally, we would be able to, when we feel stress, work through that stress or have strategies to work through that stress so that we can then access that prefrontal cortex again. And if it's with other folks like kids or other athletes we're working with, we have strategies that can help them work through that. But in a best case scenario, we're building environments that bring as little of that painful bad stress as possible. I'm going to drop something here just that, and we'll talk about it a little more in a bit, but not all stress is bad stress. Good stress is needed for us to build resilience and learn that skill. But bad stressors are the ones that push us over the line where we become dysregulated, okay? And how do we do it? We have to do it the same way that the brain works. So first we got to regulate. We can't do anything until we get there. Once we're regulated, we can make our way up to where we can relate with the world around us. And once we've done that, we can finally use that prefrontal cortex to build resilience. Because the answer to stress is not no stress, like I mentioned. We have to train our brain on stress, the same way that you all train on stroke pattern, the same way that you train on form. We have to train our brain to handle stress in the same way. Once we do all those three, we can reflect. Because as Tanita also said, it's a continuous journey. We're not always going to get it right. So those are kind of the R's that we operate within. So regulate, relate, build resilience, and then reflection. And the reason we do this in the realm of sport is because it is uniquely suited to helping us do these things. There are 3 core pillars of sport that allow us to do this naturally. The first is it's chock full of relationships. There's player to player, coach to player, assistant coach, grad assistant, athletic trainer, parents, team mom, you name it. There are people everywhere to build relationships with. We work with a gentleman by the name of Dr. Bruce Perry. He is one of the leading trauma psychologists in the world, for young people specifically. And from his 40 plus years of work, he will tell you that relational health is more predictive of a young person's ability to make their way out of adversity and thrive than any other factor. We are a bunch of nerds, and I could talk about that research all day because it's super powerful. We can leave you with a list of resources if you're interested in learning more about that. We can definitely do that too. So relationships is that first pillar. The next part of sport is that it's full of movement. I'm sure everybody in this space has seen the image of the brain after a 20-minute walk where it's lit up all over the place, and the brain that didn't go on that walk is kind of dark, right? All physical activity is good for the brain. It primes our brain for learning. It allows for us to, people will say, get our juices flowing, but it really does allow for us to open up pathways in the brain to access more of it. But there is a unique type of movement. It's a mouthful. I know, Will, our name's a mouthful, but this is also a mouthful. It's called patterned repetitive rhythmic activity. So I'll say it again. Maybe Christine will be kind and type it in the chat for me. Patterned repetitive rhythmic activity. Erging is like the best example, Amy. Thank you for naming that. It is a perfect example. So think about erging. It is patterned. It is definitely repetitive, right? And people get into a rhythm. Things like running, walking, skiing, right? When you're skiing down a hill, dribbling a soccer ball, dribbling a basketball, anything that has these features, we would put into this bucket of patterned repetitive rhythmic activity. This type of movement specifically is what we need when we're trying to regulate, because it's magic for our brain. And I know some people know this answer, but I'm going to ask you to tell me anyway. Why is it so magical for our brain when we do patterned repetitive rhythmic activity? Why do you think it's even better than general movement? Who knows? There are definitely new pathways formed. Yep. There's definitely a muscle memory. The brain does look for patterns. There's familiarity. All of these things are true. But there is, oh, someone said it. Where are you? I saw it. Mark nailed it. So all of the things you said are true. Muscle memory, absolutely. Familiarity, true. But when our brain stem's developing back, remember we talked about in utero and early childhood, in utero specifically, our brain is really working on development. It's a key moment for our brain development. In that moment is the time in our life when we are the safest. We are fed, we are warm, we can sleep whenever we want, we get the nutrients we need. All of those things are happening in utero. And the only thing that we hear is ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum of our mother's heartbeat. And so our brainstem has that kind of baked into its development. And so when we partake in patterned repetitive rhythmic activity, we're kind of faking our brain out. We're saying, wait, that movement, that rhythm reminds me of her heartbeat when I was safe. So I'm going to feel safe. And it allows us to help regulate. So sport has relationships and general movement and pattern repetitive rhythmic activity. One cool thing about pattern repetitive rhythmic activity is also that it's magical when you do it by yourself, but it has even more power when you do it with other people. We are biologically looking for connection. It's how we were developed as humans, right? We didn't live as one caveman. We had a clan. We used our clan to help keep us safe, to help raise our kids, to forage for food, all of that. Our brains have not changed. That's why isolation during COVID was so hard for everybody. We were seeking out that connection that our brain needs, right? When we do patterned repetitive rhythmic activity with other people, we kind of keep going up on each other. Like, oh, this is awesome. No, that's awesome. No, this is awesome. And you keep helping each other. It's called emotional contagion. It kind of helps you raise the stakes and feel better and get as regulated as possible. Amy, I love that you know all of these facts about the brain because you fit in with our people. And then the last piece, and this is the piece that makes sports so special. Everything about sports special, but what makes this space uniquely suited to help build resilience is that we can introduce manageable patterns of stress. So, like I said before, not all stress is bad stress. Stress that is chaotic or prolonged or acutely severe, that is bad stress. We also have to think about stress that is controllable, moderate, and predictable. And so think about your typical weight room, right? It's adding 10-pound plates to the bar or 5-pound plates to the bench press bar before you start adding 25s. You give doses that your body, it's a challenge, but it's not going to hurt you. And we're a lot better. We're not great at it, but we're a lot better at dosing physical stress with our strength and conditioning plans. We do testing, we keep charts on what people can handle. But we are not as good at handling it when it comes to mental health. Sport has, for whatever reason, as it's developed over time, only the strong survive, right? It's built for people that like it. If you can't hang, see ya, right? But we're saying, actually, if we can build environments that allow for that stress to be manageable, not only will we have deeper investment from the athlete themselves, potentially keeping them in the sport longer, but we'll have better relationships. And what happens over time, if you practice dosing stress, is if this is my stress baseline and it's flat, and I hit stress and I spike to here, right? If I have chance to come back down before I spike again and come back down, that pattern of going up and coming back down and regulating allows our baseline to rise. So our ability to handle stress goes up because we've practiced the skill of resilience. So that's another misconception. We name it all the time. You're not just born resilient. Some people aren't resilient versus others who are not. It's a skill. And so by introducing dose stress, we're able to practice that. Okay, pausing here for 1 second. We just went through a ton of brain stuff. Any questions, any thoughts, anything anyone wants to add? Lay it on us. What do you got?
I'll just say the chat is blowing up. So there's a lot of good thoughts and yeah, it looks like people are reflecting well on this stuff. So that's awesome.
Yes.
Awesome. Did someone want to ask something? I don't want to cut you off if you did.
Yes, I was just gonna say, even here at Champions Place where I live, we are we have also been made aware of the benefits of pattern rhythmic development.
Yep. Yeah, that's great. I love that it's becoming more common for people. We used to show up and people would look at us like we were crazy.
I know,
In
right?
the sports space, it's actually becoming more common that people are starting to recognize the benefits, especially at how when you all originally were like, oh, it's muscle memory, it's familiar. People can connect the dots there very easily, and they're starting to realize that the benefit for the brain is also as great as the benefit for the body. We get this question a lot around neurodivergence. That would take a really long time for us to go into, but the short answer, and I'm happy to email back and forth with you. I'll leave my email at the end about this. The short answer is being healing centered and being intentional about these things, movement, relationships, and manageable stress. They're individual to the athlete. We can create systems that will benefit the majority, but I forget who it was earlier that was saying they have this one athlete they weren't expecting. We might have to create accommodations within our system that allow for the athlete to just show up as they are. And that includes folks that have neurodivergence. Thanks, Christine. She just dropped my email. Please, please, please email me. We would love that conversation. Any last bits on the brain or on why sport before we dig into bias?
Jillian, I thought there was a really an interesting question here. So, yes, can the ethos of competition lead to forms of exclusion where competition has sort of winners,
Yeah.
losers, mostly losers. So how do we kind of how do we wrestle with that?
It's a wonderful question, and it absolutely tracks, right? Yes, sport is competitive. We created it that way. But what we've done is we've created exclusive spaces where it's very hard to find sport that develops skill or sport that's not kind of the end of all be all is winning. We don't introduce those spaces as much anymore. But what we would say is that, and we do our healing centered sport kind of training. This is all, that's what it's about. But basically, it's the opportunity for young people to dose their competition as well. So if we are in practice and we are setting up drills and the drills are our speed drills, instead of saying, this is the drill we're doing today. And if it was me, I'd be like, ugh, I'm slow. I'm going to be last in the drill as always. This is depressing. Why do I come here? Saying, here's 3 different drills. Pick the one that feels right to you. If I think you're ready to move to a different one or that you would thrive in a different one, after 10 minutes when I blow my whistle, you can rotate there. But giving those options so that it's not, you have to be the best, you have to compete. But in terms of competition and losing, when it comes to the stress response, it's trained as well. Right. And so it's the same thing of where the big reaction, the big response, we are able to kind of move through that in a quicker way because we've built the resilience to it.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Jillian.
Yeah, no problem. Ooh, Rachel, let's talk about this at the very end. So Rachel asked about how we kind of build skills over a spectrum in rowing. Yep. So Christine's hitting on some of them, but scaffolding that stress allows for folks to tolerate the competition and kind of build up to it. So instead of saying like, we're diving right into the scrimmage, it's how you have drills and games and practices before the scrimmage. All right. I love this. See, rowing community, they always bring the heat. I love it.
Jill, sorry, there was one question we
please
missed
do.
in there, and I don't have a great answer for it, but maybe you do. Bill was asking about the impact of aerobic activity in this sort of mix of things, and I guess I don't know, and maybe you do or somebody else in here knows.
Yeah, basic. I think just basic, without going data and like all of that, is that the anaerobic activity gives more access to air in the brain pathways, and it allows for you to access parts of your brain. So it's also really good. It just doesn't do the same thing as kind of taking that small step up to patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity does with the regulation piece. It's all good. But when we talk to coaches about pattern, repetitive, rhythmic activity, we tell them there's already tools in your toolkit. Warm-ups. You could do a walk-in chat with your team. There's so many ways for you to incorporate, or already that you're doing it and you just didn't know that it was in your back pocket to use again. You can use it for interventions. You can, all sorts of ways that it can show up. All right. So now that you know all the things about the brain and why sport is special for this, let's talk about why bias is kind of our inhibitor to creating the inclusive spaces that I think all of us have the intention of creating, and maybe we just don't recognize that we're not in some spaces. But here's why we need to think about this. So like I mentioned before, bottom to the top in all things. So when something comes towards us, some form of input comes towards us in the world, it works its way up through the brain, as you see there. It kind of travels its way up into the front. We react to it, and then we can think about it and have the response to it that we would want. Dr. John Rady, yes, we love him, and Spark is a wonderful book. Everyone should read Spark. I agree with you, Bill. Here's where bias comes in. So if we call the kind of brainstem area, the reactive brain, the limbic system, the emotional brain, and the prefrontal cortex, our thinking brain, implicit bias lives down here at the bottom portion of our brain. So as we are developing and as we walk through the world, we sort of, the way that I like to explain it is we get a bunch of filters that kind of sit on top of our brainstem. Think of it like an Instagram filter or something that you see through it and it changes the picture. we have filters that we kind of add on or change throughout our life based on our lived experience. So if I live in a town where everybody has green hair, my green hair filter is safe and normal. So there's a filter for people with green hair where if I'm in a different town and I see someone with green hair, I'm like, oh, green hair, it goes up through my brainstem, hits that green hair filter, doesn't set off my stress response because I'm like, oh, green hair, love that. And then I can continue on using my brain. But if I'm from a town with green hair and the town that we've had, trouble with historically, we don't go over there, whatever the connotation is with purple hair, and it's a negative connotation, that filter builds the same way, but with a negative impact. So for example, I now am in the green in my town and someone with purple hair comes through. That information goes up through my brainstem, hits that purple hair filter, and yikes, my stress response goes off. Okay. So those filters are types of implicit bias that we build over time just by interacting with the world. So the things that are safe and familiar to me become my, let's call them green filters because they're friendly. So like a stoplight, green and red. My green filters are things that are safe and familiar to me. Foods, smells, physical attributes, things that are kind of common in my culture or where I grew up. Those are green. And if I'm not exposed to other things outside of my filters, it's very hard for me to build up green filters for other things. One piece of this to also know is that people who are close to us, people that we trust, their implicit biases, they play a role in ours. So if my mom is horrified of flying on airplanes, and I've never been on an airplane before, but that's what I hear about airplanes, I'm going to have a filter that is scared out of my mind of airplanes because that's what my mom is scared of. So it has that same kind of powerful effect. Media consumption, the things that we are seeing kind of on TV, in movies, what types of characters look like what, all of those things are kind of biased into our brain based on what's safe and familiar. Christine actually has an example that we use sometimes in that her son, Milo, he grew up watching soccer with Christine, and she always watched women's soccer. And so Men's World Cup was coming on, and Milo was like, whoa, men play soccer? Milo had no clue that men played soccer. And it was because Christine had kind of reverse biased him by only giving kind of the exposure to her own soccer play, as well as what she was watching on TV. So these biases, they, you did reverse bias the heck out of him, Christine. That's hysterical. So they are developing as we move through the world. Now, I want to be like very, very clear though here. We've been talking about implicit bias here, not overt things like racism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, misogyny. Those are beliefs, a set of beliefs that live in the cognitive or higher functioning portions of our brain. They live up here. So I want to be very clear of the difference. We all are guaranteed to have implicit bias because of the neurobiological development of our brain. But our set of structures and belief systems, that is what creates the other parts of this. Okay? So all of this reflects our experiences. So here's what happens. Like I said before, information comes up. It hits my catalog of experiences, which are all different shapes, sizes, right? All different things in the world. I've got a filter for all of it. It goes through that filter, and it might set off my stress response, dependent on how my filters kind of react to that input. That stress response then changes what my brain is going to do. So it gets to my limbic system as kind of a different message at this point, right? Because my brain is like, that's not good. I think about it, or I react to it, or I just go about my business because it went through green filters and it matches my lived experience, where then it makes its way all the way up to the prefrontal cortex and has to be processed. And we have to think about how we're going to act with whatever information that we got. But these distorting filters impact the natural ways that we want to build spaces. It impacts the way that we show up as coaches. It impacts the way that we show up as mentors, as teammates, as colleagues. They impact everything that we do because that's our familiar, that's our safe and normal. And acknowledging our safe and normal doesn't mean that we are, going over a line or that we are talking about something taboo. It allows for us to do deeper reflection on the spaces that we create. And so, just quick example that happens in sport. I coach with a male coach. We show up to the field and the referee or the umpire immediately walks over to my co-coach and talks to him like he's the head coach, right? I'm the head coach. But because of the world and the structures that have been created around this referee, the immediate reaction is to walk over to the male. So I don't think sport intentionally thought, like, I only want our referees talking to men. I want them to talk to the coach, but the byproduct of the spaces we've created has led to that outcome. So what do we do, right? How do we change this? And to explain it, we're going to talk a little bit about something I think we're all familiar with because we've talked about it a little bit, but we're going to talk about how this compares to things like muscle memory. So muscle memory, I mean, there's different numbers, but people say like you need to do it thousands of times to change your muscle memory. I was a softball player and I can still, if you ask me to get into the box to get ready to hit, I would still do the same thing. Step in right foot first, then left foot. I would do 3 swings towards the pitcher because that was my muscle memory of getting in the box. It would take a lot of practice to change that. So here's an example for you. A soccer player joins the track team. The track coach notices that she runs with her arms in a way that's better suited to shield the defender from the ball. So she was keeping her arms out because in soccer, you have to create space to keep the ball safe. And that detracts from her speed. So that coach recognized muscle memory that was a detriment to the outcome of that athlete that we were striving for. So what you tell me as coaches, what would you do in that situation? If you wanted to change that behavior, what would you do? You can come off mute or type in the chat, whatever feels good. You can see people typing, so that's why I'm sitting here in silence. Totally, George. Explain the situation, give the athlete specific examples to decondition the soccer muscle memory. Yep, that's part of it for sure. Acknowledge where the movement came from and that it served a purpose. Explain it's no longer beneficial, then coach the athlete on how to do it differently in the new environment. Awesome. Yep, teach her to cross-country ski using classic style. Oh, you could just put her in a boat. Absolutely. Say, forget it. You're getting in a boat. But all of those things are true. So like you said, the coach recognized the behavior that they want that athlete to relearn. To relearn it, it takes research. So a few of you said, show classic forms, show why historically this would be better. Give examples for that athlete to see. And representation, speaking of examples, is giving them an opportunity to have new experiences that could potentially help change or shift their bias. In this case, muscle bias. And then it takes practice. So we have to have an opportunity to practice the new way in a space that allows for us to get reminders when we see that reappearing. So we need to be able to recognize the bias, relearn other ways or better ways to show up. And then we have to have practice at busting that bias. And part of the practice is having folks that remind you or ways you can remind yourself to make that change. Now, here's where sport comes in. This process is wonderful, but it has flaws in the sense that you can't do these things if you're not in a healing-centered space, if you're not in a space that feels safe. I'm sorry I'm forgetting your name, but you were talking about an athlete that responded poorly to constructive criticism. In spaces where we're going to be breaking bias, it might feel like that. And so we need to make sure that that work is contained in a healing-centered space that includes the things we talked about before. It allows for regulation. It allows for practice and the building of resilience in a dosed way. And it includes safe and caring relationships. So one can't operate, or I should say the inner one can't operate perfectly in a perfect world without the structure that we've created, the inclusive culture that we've created by creating a healing-centered space. I see a great question in the chat. It moved. Hold on, sorry, let me find him. If the soccer player joins track but is still also doing soccer, how would you navigate relearning without eliminating the muscle memory still needed for soccer? One doesn't, so Christine, tell me if you have a better answer for this, but I would say that one doesn't negate the other in the sense that it can still exist. And you recognize when it's useful and when it's not, and your body knows which one to utilize in that space. Christine, what would you say?
Yeah, so this example is actually me. I was the soccer player who turned into the track athlete. So for my default continued to always be the like soccer arms, right? Give myself space. So it was my track coach who had to give me the cue to run like a track athlete every time. So I never went back to soccer with track arms. I always had soccer arms. But I was trained enough so that I knew, so that when I switched to track, I knew I was typing a response and I was sort of playing around with the idea of like code switching, right? So like when, so like people need to know that they need to speak a certain way or dress a certain way or act in a certain way in one situation, and they're able to sort of like make the switch into a different sort of way for a different situation. So I think it's sort of like that. We'll always sort of have our baseline, and my baseline will always be soccer, even though I've got great cues on how to end up running like a soccer or running like a track athlete sometimes.
Yeah, so Christine's coach actually said, pretend you're eating chips that are in your pocket. So take the chips out of your pocket and bring it to your mouth, right? So you're going down in your pocket, your arms are close to your sides. And that was the reminder that the coach could scream out to get Christine's brain to kind of remember, right? So that's the representation and the reminders. That's how that shows up. So this is the same thing that we would ask for folks to do when we're talking about busting implicit bias. So not muscular. The filters we were talking about before, how do we bust those? So that's what the last little bit of this session is going to be. We have a bunch of resources available that go deeper into this, but let's start here because I think these are very practical, tangible things. Tanita hit on a bunch of them. We just kind of put them in an athletics context. So the first one is language matters. Recognize and aim to understand common ways that athletes are referred to. Males are muscular, and they're complimented for being strong, whereas muscular females, negative words, butch or masculine, they're utilized in a negative context. Or get your man when you're on defense, right? The things that we constantly utilize as a filter that is just part of our sport experience, we have to start to recognize where they show up. And Tanita said, and we'll echo this wholeheartedly, you have to believe live experience and seek it out and ask the questions and open the lines of communication so that you understand more effectively someone else's filter and why that language sets off the stress response for other people and that they don't match yours. So you're trying to get better about recognizing language that we are utilizing in the spaces we create. So the example before about the athlete that uses she, they pronouns and is in the girls' boat. I love that the people in the girls' boat or put them together and say, can you come up with a team name? And use that. But just ways that you can, again, recognize the language. The binary exists in rowing. Talking about how the binary exists in rowing is a first step. And asking them, what do you want me to use? How would you feel best? Okay, so the first one is language matters. Oh, I just put up that last couple bullets. I think the last one is extremely important also. Acknowledge that you're continuously learning, or that you aren't great at pronouns, or that you are trying to be better, or, please let me know. Open the door for that reminder. So that eating chips, people aren't going to remind you if you are not welcoming of the reminder. So acknowledging that you're learning and seeking out support and being better can often be a helpful way to let folks know that you're trying to be better. The next one is forgetting, leave it at the door, right? We often tell athletes to leave their emotions, their baggage, their this, their that at the door and come to practice with a clear head. They can't leave their race, their gender. They can't leave those things at the door, right? And if filters exist in brains of people, those filters exist and they're not being left at the door, right? It's a myth. It's the myth of color blindness, right? We do see color. It's not that we don't see color here. It's that we see color here and we're doing something about recognizing it. Okay. The next one, sorry, is fair, not equal. And in sport, we struggle with this, but we will do it when it comes to things like strength training or skill development. But equal for everyone is not the same thing, getting the same thing. Fair is everyone getting what they actually need. So differentiating instruction. We have a colleague named Ethan. He is a college track and field coach. In the beginning of the season, he asks his athletes, how do you want to communicate with me after a race? Maybe you want to talk on the bus. Maybe you want to write me an email. Maybe you want to have a meeting tomorrow. But tell me what feels right to you. And he will accommodate that ask. Right? And so fair is what they get, not equal. But fair is what they need. And Christine talked about power and control in the chat. Giving back some of that power from the system that we've created, which is full of power dynamics, is a great way to help people feel safe or safer. So again, value lived experience, try to partner with diversely led organizations for their input and guidance. What is best practice when I have a diverse team that's showing up across different spectrums, racial, religious, gender? How do I show up in the best way? Convene an advisory board, recruit the people that are going to be interacting with your athletes, recruit folks that display different lived experiences. And then resist the pressure that we often have to make our space like a pro space. It doesn't have to be. We can still build skill, build resilience, and build quality athletes without it being kind of cutthroat. One of the things we get a lot is that we're kind of like the kumbaya people and we're going to make athletes soft and all that. The neuroscience actually tells us that by acting and utilizing healing-centered sport principles and dosing stress and doing the things we mentioned before, they're not mutually exclusive. They actually work like the same trajectory. So not only will they feel safer, their stress response will go up, like their baseline of what they can handle, but you will have more consistent and high quality outcomes. It leads to both high performance as well as better mental health or better response to the space we've created. And then the last one is unconditional positive regard. We talk about this when you're being healing centered. This is kind of a core principle that we talk about a lot. A player should never feel like their worth is dependent on their performance. We want to make sure that they know that however they show up, we are grateful and thankful and welcoming of that. And they have things to contribute to us, and we want to know what they are. And so when we're thinking of unconditional positive regard, these are really the pre-work. How do we ensure that we are setting up spaces where folks feel seen, where they feel safe, where they feel like thought has been put into that space and creating it in a way that's safe for them? We listed 4 strategies today. We do have a one-pager that I'll share that has 10 strategies. And then tomorrow we'll be back to workshop the strategies with y'all for like a shorter period tomorrow to talk about your programs and kind of how these things show up. But any questions real quick before we were going to open it up to questions next anyway. So why don't I just do that and we can kind of chat through. Christine, is there anything you want to add?
No, it's sounds great, Jill. Thank you. I was just again replying to your very first question in the chat, but maybe we should talk it out instead. George is asking why some sort of like about coaching and abusive behavior and why that's showing up, and how can we protect our organizations and why organizations can pull into formation to protect abusers. And I think the question is like, why do we end up with coaches taking advantage of their situation and their power?
Are you asking me to answer that one? Oh, okay, sure.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think I think it's probably for the reason that you're thinking, because they win. They've exhibited that they can reach success, and and the rest of it's a byproduct, right? Like, oh, they're abusive, they're churning out championships, and we need the revenue to make our college function. I went to Michigan State. Tom Izzo is very well known as a basketball coach who is very physically presenting of what can be seen as like aggressive, abusive, yelling at athletes. And is that okay? The Michigan State athletes that play under him would say yes, because he's the first person to build relationships with them and their family, and they feel like they've built enough with him to do that. But because we see Tom Izzo and Nick Saban and Meyer, and I could go on and on and on about coaches that exhibit behaviors that we wouldn't want to replicate. But because we see them and they're successful, dad number 5 shows up at Little League practice and is exhibiting behaviors that are way too intense for a group of 11 to 14-year-olds. But that's the representation that we see. We do see a few on the other side, like Steve Kerr's of the world, Popovich. There are some coaches that do it the other way, but we've created kind of the filter for what a coach is. So that same filter we were talking about before, we've created a filter that a coach creates a system, athletes operate in that system, or they need to go. And that's what sport has created and allowed. And so until we continue to do this work and kind of flip it on its head, and have more Ethans in the world who are asking athletes, how should I communicate with you? And people see the benefit of it. We're fighting kind of an uphill battle here. But if you figure out the answer, please let us know, because you'll make a ton of money figuring that out. All right, so Amy asked a question, how do we balance asking athletes for input versus making them feel like we are asking them to speak for the entire class or group? Love that. And again, it is not folks' job to educate us on their lived experience unless they choose to. It is my job to find resources and education and to do the work for myself. So if there is a young person who does use she, they pronouns and other kids don't understand that, the balance, in my opinion, would be that you seek out the resources, you learn what we should be doing, and you are the one to help create the space to talk about that. That might include having a one-on-one conversation with that athlete about what they see and what they experience, and including that into what you do then with the team. But it definitely would be not their job to make you better. It's our job to do the work and make ourselves better.
I think those are also, yeah, ignorance is a those are really, especially with pronouns, you know, people there, you could have 2 people who use she, they pronouns on your team, and each person would like them or like prefer them to be used in a certain way. So there is a little bit like, get your baseline understanding of what she, they pronouns are on your own. And then it feels much better for somebody to say, this is what I learned about she, they pronouns. Is this how you would like me to use them with you? Rather than just asking each individual to educate you on their pronouns, I think.
Any other questions? Awesome. If anything pops up, feel free to come back. But that QR code will take you to a bunch of different resources for our organization, including the inclusive coaching guide, the one pager that's kind of mini up there. It'll also take you to our healing centered sport playbook, which includes a lot of the strategies that we had to gloss over today due to time. But it's all free and you can access that via that QR code. Tomorrow we will be back. So if you ruminate on this a little bit tonight, think about kind of your programs, your context. We'll be back to talk it through tomorrow. So bring your hard questions. But as always, thank you so very much for allowing us to come into your community. It's always awesome being with the rowing folks that join us. Oh, sorry, Christine, is there more that I'm missing in the chat? Okay, cool. And then I can drop my email again. Christine dropped it earlier, but here you go. There you go.
Thank you so much, Jillian. Always amazing to hear from you and really appreciate it. Christine, thanks for your help as well. Like Jillian said, so tomorrow at the end of Summit for the last 45 minutes, 30 to 45 minutes, we are actually going to spend some time kind of workshopping some of this. And so if there are specific issues that you all are wrestling with, working on, Jillian is going to be back tomorrow to actually help you all workshop some of these specific things that you're thinking about and wrestling with at your own individual programs. And Christine, awesome. So that'll be great. Again, Jillian, Christine, really appreciate you being here.